This is Duke University.
I think I'm just going to launch right in. I don't think I need a lengthy introduction for Charles Taylor. I think most of you know him. And he's been here for a few days speaking about on different topics. Today he's going to wear his Bouchard-Taylor Commission hat and address how Quebec dealt with a lot of these issues. And I think, as both of you mentioned it, one of the things as we saw in the historical part is that it was, sort of different forms of Christianity duking it out in the early days. Now, in our increasingly pluralistic, diverse, and secular, ironically, paradoxically, communities, societies, the questions are different, but yet some of them are still the same, which is individual versus the group, the common core, the common public values, which they talked about all the time in Quebec, but also issues of gender equality versus religious rights, which has been that's an issue that's been raised repeatedly, particularly in the Quebec context. So I'm just going to let you talk about your experience working on that and the recommendations which were laid out there and then promptly shelved and sort of forgotten, except by academics who continue to write about them.
Yes, well, I don't know quite how to fit into this because there's something very special about Quebec here, some special factors are operating. In some ways, it looks like what you were talking about at the end, where people are lining up against a lot of religious demands in the name of laïcité. Laïcité is not the translation of secularism, but if you move to the other political culture, the kind of, as it were, analogy to secularization in the French case. And we're very, a lot of our people who want to really plead for laïcité are very influenced by the French example, even though that has been very distant from our history. But then I think you have to, in order to see what's going on, you have to try to understand why laïcité has become such a powerful issue, see? Because what it comes from is a great cultural discomfort that a lot of people in Quebec began to feel at the prominence of religious exemptions given under the name of reasonable accommodation. And part of this, of course, the background to all this is the geopolitical issue of Islamic terrorism and so on. But it's clearly not only that, because as you were saying, the Kirpan case was the one that really sparked off as a big sort of wave of opinion. The sense it's gone too far. Where's it going to end? We heard a lot of rhetoric when we made our commission consultation, because we actually asked people, and you had to go through, speech after speech after speech of this kind before you got the feel for the real emotional. And the real emotional push behind it is the fear that we're going to lose our identity. And of course, it's very important. There's been a society, a French-speaking society, that's been fighting for 200 years to defend itself in a huge Anglo-Saxon sea and so on. So this, if you can connect to that worry, you've got a powerful motivation. And there was an opposition party sort of surfing on this, and the commission exists because the premier at the time, just before an election, didn't want to have to talk about this, so he said, don't discuss this in the election campaign. We're going to have a commission. This is, the typical politician's thing. And we both, Charles and I both knew we're being used, but we thought, this is our chance. Use us. I mean, of course, they used us only as get through the election, and they won it. And then they didn't really like the recommendations. Well, now, in the light of this, a lot of legal issues have to be seen in different terms. You see, let's take this question that you raised. You said, if you don't ask for the reasonability, or you don't ask for there being some warrant by the authorities in the religious community for making, and the Amsterdam cases, a lot of rabbis came and said, this is not really important. And the Supreme Court ruled for the guy anyway, on the grounds that it's what the conscience, the individual conscience, how that person sees his Jewish demands of his Jewish faith that really count. Now, this is something that we ended up aligning ourselves with in the commission report. And the reason really was that the most important bulwark against the move of this kind of blanket refusal of all these things, the important bulwark was the importance of freedom of conscience. So this, it is very important even for us to say freedom of conscience, which is not necessarily religious exercise. Because we used lots of examples in the argument. What if you had two people in jail, and there's a menu that they all have, and includes meat, and a couple of people get up and say, I want an exemption from this. And one is a Hindu, and the other reads Peter Singer all the time and is an atheist, right? See, the argument was always coming back to us, a religious demand. That's very dangerous. It's very dangerous. So we mustn't, even if it's a religious demand, we have to look at it negatively. And you would ask these people, well, okay, so you would give the Peter Singer guy the exemption and tell the Hindu you got to go on eating beefsteak. Well, no, okay. So this became part of the argument and so we in the laïcité chapter, we really stressed, and this is published as a book. Jocelyn McClure and I made a book on this, laïcité et liberté de conscience, right? Secularism and freedom of conscience. But then I asked a deeper question here I want to bring out here. Why was this issue, which really, the motivation of which was kind of cultural fear of our being changed, why was it coded always in terms of religious demands? And here's something very significant, I think, about the whole Islamophobia phenomenon in general, which of course was operating in our case in the Western world. There is a real deep problem about what is religion and what isn't religion. I think you were raising that earlier, but I want to raise it in a slightly different form. I mean, when people say, for instance, Islam, don't give in to any demands, and then they say, why? Well, it's going to go to extreme cases like female genital mutilation and honor killing and so on. And you say, well, is that Islam? Honor killing, some Greeks did this, and some, FGM, some, Christian community. It's, now, why is it religion? Why is it even thought religion? Well, because very often the people from small, tight societies, for them, everything is religion. It goes back to famous Caillois, Roger Caillois, la religion est partout. In earlier communities and more tight communities, everything that is prescribed is thought to be part of the religion. And then in the great post-axial religions, people come in and say, well, that's not really part of it, that is part of it. So you won't find an imam in Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo saying that, FGM or honor killing. But for the people themselves who are tempted to do these things, it has, they don't make a discrimination. What our whole tradition demands in general, right? But there's some unfortunate push in our present society for this to be coded as religion on both sides. See, if you're really worried about, oh, Jesus, strange around here, I come to Montreal and I used to know what it was like. Come to Montreal from Lac Saint-Jean, When I walk around the street, am I in Quebec anymore, right? If that's the worry, right? Well, if you say, it makes me uncomfortable, that's not a reason. You can't. Okay, it's something terrible. It's a religion demand, right? And then in the context of a society which very rapidly deserted the Catholic Church, where religion was seen as rather oppressive by lots of people, then it's a kind of return of religion. So you can kind of put it in that way, and it sounds kosher. I'm using the wrong metaphor here, but it sounds okay. If you're from the other side, if you're someone who wants to do it, and there's do something exceptional, and there's a lot of objections to it, and you want to get your point across, well, what are you going to plead? Not just my culture, no, but that I have religious obligations. So we've got ourselves a bit painted into a corner. So I don't know how to get out of this, but there is a tendency by both sides to up the ante, up the moral ante on this, both for and against, by coding it in that way, which has, in the end, very unhealthy consequences, because it leads to all the things we reject are demanded by this unreasonable religion on one side, and on the other side, it leads to, again, putting in question whether this isn't a clash of civilizations going on here, and so on. So our attempt to navigate through all these waters in order to, because there is, here we don't even have something like that you have maybe with objections to gay marriage, where people might feel that I, a believer in marriage, as a man and a woman, somehow my rights are being, that's a pretty far-fetched argument, but you can see how psychologically that can be the case. Here there's something much more extraneous. It's just because of a kind of cultural discomfort that these demands are these burdens are being placed upon people. And so we had to, and it's in the context where the concept of laïcité was extremely important. We couldn't get through all this and get out to what we thought to be a good conclusion without taking on the issue of what is laïcité. So we're involved in a big argument which is transatlantic, see, because they've been fighting it in France and they lost. Our side were lost in France. But we had a lot of help from, for instance, Jean Bobéreau is a wonderful historian of laïcité in France, who's really, I think, got a magnificently fine grasp of 1904 and 1905. He sees that it isn't a single thing, that there were different strands, that Combe was on one wavelength and Jaurès and Muir on another wavelength. And so and as a matter of fact, he then published a book, which is ironic afterwards, Le Québec, l'avenir de la France, ? And I was thinking that he could win his argument in France, but then the French got worse. But so we had to redefine this, or define this clearly. And we defined it in terms of two basic principles, you see. Neutrality, that the state not be aligned, and freedom of conscience. Those are the two things. And as against defining it in terms of some particularly tough attitude and policy towards religion, see, which is how the Républicains in France tend to define it, and how the people who were wanting this tough line were piggybacking on that. And that's very interesting in Quebec because of the coalition, which was behind restrictive legislation here, and which was, behind therefore the recent charter of so-called values, you have about 90% are really actuated by this kind of cultural fear, and only 10% are real, laïcistes. Huh? They're just a tiny, tiny group, but the argument of this tiny percentage here is being piggybacked and sort of used exactly because it's a really kosher type of argument by the vast majority. And I'll finish with one anecdote which illustrates this, so we had these two principles, right? Neutrality of the state and freedom of conscience. So we had a report which really espoused what we call laïcité ouverte, open. Incidentally, a word used by the earlier commission which recommended that you move from confessional boards to linguistic boards, the Prou Commission, they sort of pioneered this laïcité ouverte expression, so we took it up. So that was one side. And so we have this, as I say, neutrality of the state and a laïcité ouverte in the sense that it is maximally unoppressive to individual conscience. So, and that was going to be our basis. We had, and we can only win, and we only will eventually, I hope, win this battle by convincing people of that redefinition and of the importance of not, as it were, burdening individuals. And so this may not be terribly kosher in somebody else's situation. You may think that there's some problems intellectually. A lot of my American friends will say, you've changed since we discussed it before. That you're now, you used to be much more, anyway never, but this, you can see how, in that situation, I don't think we could responsibly do anything else, thinking not only in terms of the big principles, but politically. So we staked our whole position on that in the hope that, which I think is gradually being met, that you find that the more people actually meet Muslims, or the more these fears wane, that they aren't something very, very alien, that they can collaborate and so on and so on. So we have to hold, our idea is we have to stop the society from doing something irreparable to itself by enacting this. Yes, so but the anecdote that sort of gets it all is that we produced this report, and the day we produced it, the government acted on one of our measures. One of our measures was, in terms of neutrality, that the National Assembly, above the National Assembly is a huge crucifix. It's put there by Duke Islamic in the 1930s in one of his attempts to instrumentalize the Catholic clergy and so on. And we said, remove the crucifix from the National Assembly and grant maximum liberty of conscience. The government acted on measure one the same day, negatively. And this was not just the government, it was a unanimous vote of the National Assembly to keep the crucifix there. So this shows to what extent it's kind of cultural fear. And I must say, it was an education for me I will never regret. Hearing people again and again talking and saying, clergy, le curé, forcé, ma grand-mère, to have so many children and so on one hand, but c'est notre patrimoine. So it's our patrimony. Yeah. And that's what the government was doing in running the last election. It's not. It said, Madame Marois, c'est pas la religion, c'est le patrimoine. It's not religion, it's a heritage, you see. So you have this, we have expression in the French-speaking world at all. We use it in France and in Quebec, catho-laïcité, right? Which is really what's operating here. I mean, it's kind of Catholic cultural tradition, but very strongly laïque. And another feature that catho-laïcité has is you understand all religions as a kind of model on the Catholic model. So in contemporary Catholicism, there's nothing I have to wear in order to be proper Catholic, right? So why are these people wearing that stuff? Well, I mean, that's the way they do things. No. They must be making a statement. They must be saying, there's something wrong with your society. Exactly the same thing you heard in France. I mean, in France, speeches by Chirac and so on, these people are making a statement. They're telling us that our republic is no good. And various Muslims said, no, we just, and this catho-laïcité is a real sort of mindset in which all these things come together. The patrimony, the laïcité, the inability to understand that other religious views and so on just constructed differently. So, I recognize that the choices we made in defining laïcité could be challenged by other people in other circumstances. But in our circumstances, I don't see what else, what else would have been better than this choice. But I recognize, when you were wanting earlier about not imposing some limits of what can be demanded in the name of religion X, which is the way we used to do it before. We call a priest, we call a rabbi, call an imam, say, is this person being reasonable in terms of, and we opted to go the other way in our situation. I think that was the best thing.
Thank you. Oh, I just want one little quote from the report. Like all democracies in the world, Quebec must seek to reach a consensus against a backdrop of growing diversity, renew the social bond, accommodate difference by combating discrimination, and promote an identity, a culture, and a memory without creating exclusion or division. Sounds good to me.
Easier said than done.
Yeah, easier said than done. But what I think is interesting is that we've gone from this sort of, Catholic versus Christian versus Protestant, and we didn't even talk about Huguenots, sort of earlier debate through this sort of expansion of notion of religious freedom to what's clearly more political and identitary than really religious. And that's why I wanted the sort of the political debate that went through it. And what we've also gone from is this sort of notion of Kevin was quoting this civil religion that we have in the United States, which is, of course, Protestant or Christian, in a wider sense, to this sort of secularism. And I love the caton de laïcité. I'd actually never heard that term. I love it. But I'm not so sure that that we're really moving towards a consensus here, which sort of is distressing. I wish that we were. But anyway, I now open it up. We've caught up a little bit, so we have time for lunches arriving, but we have time for some discussion. And anybody? Oh, I see the hands go up. Right.
Thank you all three for the really fantastic presentation. I just wanted to, so it's more of an invitation, I guess, to talk than a question. Something that Professor Van Praat mentioned, and I think something that Professor Young also touched on, and of course, Mr. Taylor, how important is the Supreme Court, or how important are the highest sort of juridical bodies in any country when it comes to framing understanding sort of on the ground on every day about people's everyday experience with religion. We know, for example, that if we were to look at sort of the aggregate of all the courts or all the debates and discussions that are had in everyday life, that only very few really are brought to the very, very top, right? But I think no one is going to dispute the fact that these legal bodies are also extremely powerful. So if you could just speak to perhaps that, or elaborate on some of the things that you touched on a little more, I'd be grateful.
Well, I think religion's an area where both the court's capabilities and its limits really come out. So probably the most widely disobeyed court rulings that there are in the school prayer area, right? I mean, so you have very clear language from the Supreme Court and very clear violations all over the country a lot of the time. I think the court has moved the public sense of what's okay, but it hasn't moved it as far as the opinions purport to move it. And the other thing is the whole RFRA and Arlupa experience illustrates the tug-of-war between the court and Congress, right, about what the meaning of even of the legal terms are, much less of what the norms should be out in society. And Congress has not been willing to cede to the court, the right to definitively define rights to religious exercise.
So Jane, when she introduced me, and Ernie said that we had clerked for the Supreme Court, and that is true. I clerked for the Chief Justice of Canada in his last year, and I learned a lot doing that. I have great respect for the court. and the work it does, and I spend a lot of time reading and analyzing decisions, and at the same time in my own scholarship, I work very hard to, kind of from a law and society perspective, to put court judgments in their place, if you like. I think the Supreme Court of Canada and the understanding of the place of the Supreme Court of Canada has learned a lot from the U.S., for good or bad, and particularly since 1982, with the Charter, the court has become more front and center in thinking through how we understand ourselves generally as a society. And I'm not about to say the Supreme Court shouldn't play a role, and does play an important role, but there's a need for humility, not only by the court itself, it does what it is asked to do, but a kind of understanding of this kind of perspective of humility from the court, that it does not, cannot raise children, teach in schools, figure out the conversations that doctors have with patients about abortion, for example. And it's fascinating to see in Quebec in particular how the Supreme Court of Canada has become a favorite source of great complaint, and also, however, this primary source for thinking about what we're forced to do or what we should do, without realizing that there's a whole lot of power outside the court to come up with best practices in terms of running schools or other institutions, etc.
Can I just say that in my reading about the Bouchard-Taylor Commission, I confess I have read the summary, which was long enough, not the whole report, but it seemed to me one of your primary recommendations was, if you can avoid litigation, you argue for harmonization rather than litigation. Which, it's no, well, for a lawyer, it's no fun. But if you'd like to, but if you'd like to speak to that.
No, because one of the things we had to face was the idea that because of these spectacular cases like the Kirpan and so on, that everything was falling apart, that the institutions were not going to work anymore. And so we actually went around and asked a lot of institutions, particularly school and hospital, and it wasn't like that at all. I mean, for one thing, what you discover is that you have to say no sometimes, right? And there's different ways of saying no. One very, very talked about issue, naturally, because it interests male-female equality, was various male parents, cousins' parents, insisting, for instance, when my wife gives birth, it must be with a woman doctor. See, so in various hospitals, Saint Justine, for instance, they just sat them down and said, well, look, this is how it works. Somebody is giving birth 3 o'clock in the morning, and there's a doctor on call. And, how the hell can we, 9 months before, say, we knew it was going to be 3 o'clock on April, but we don't. So please understand. Now, when people were sat down and talked to like that, 99% of cases, I said, okay, I see. But if you think about what are you asking? If you took that kind of attitude, then there got to be this kind of hardening. And the institutions that had most successfully worked out how to tell that people were the ones that had the least problems arising out of the actual situation where you have to say no. And it was very, public, particularly with the propaganda by people who were making a fuss about this, they didn't understand that reasonable accommodation means you can say no. You have reasonable grounds, right? And they, of course, there was a great deal of jokes about reasonable accommodation, because they were thinking of things like the Kirpan as being very unreasonable. Even again, they didn't know the details of it. And so what we discovered was that there was and we had a number of recommendations about this. There were certain institutions that had really worked out, because they'd had a lot of experience. And we suggested having some kind of, for instance, in medical institutions, having some kind of general spreading of the best practice jurisprudence, knowledge from the institutions that have done very well to the institutions still struggling, and that if you could get this best practice in operation, the number of cases where people would want to contest of any kind, let alone litigate, would go down. And there's much better society if these things are worked out in that kind of way. So you need to have a way of dealing with people's demands, which can produce this kind of, okay, we understand.
Rob, did you have a question?
Oh, sorry. Ever since the polygamy case, I mean, every time the Congress, the Assembly, the courts make a decision, aren't they in fact taking the governmental stance of defining religion? And therefore, separation of church and state breaks down right from the very structure that we put in place. Just responses?
So I think the critical problem in religious liberty doctrine is you have a trade-off between the breadth and the depth of protection. So we don't, Smith, the rule that if it's a generally applicable law, it's just not a religious liberty problem. This is only about laws that single out religions for discriminatory treatment. That comes from a reluctance, if we instead we allow exemptions from generally applicable laws, that means everybody's going to come out of the woodwork and want an exemption for this, that, and the other thing. And we're going to have to determine which ones of these are religious claims, which ones of these are sincere claims, and weed all of that stuff out, and that's going to be hopeless, right? So the idea is if we want to have strong protection for religious liberty, then it can't go very broad. But then you end up excluding a lot of claims that are probably pretty decent claims. And that's a really difficult thing. I mean, my own view is the Constitution says religion. And so you can't not have a definition if you're going to run a religion clause. And it is true that the Constitution just provides certain protections for religious belief that it doesn't provide for political beliefs or other kinds of beliefs that you might have. The same problem comes up in the draft cases, right? So people say, there's a religious exemption, and then people say, well, I have an equally strong moral objection to military service, but it's not religious in nature. Should that come in? And as a matter of statutory law, the courts have generally allowed that. But then you have very difficult line drawing problems. What's a religion is really hard. I have students who wanted to get married, but they didn't want a conventional church service. So one of their friends had a comic book that had on the back page a little form that you could fill out for some church. And he sent it off in the mail along with $1.50 or something like that, got back a certificate that he was a minister now, and he married them, right? So is that religion or not, right? It's very, very difficult to draw those kinds of lines. And that's kind of the central conundrum of all of this doctrine.
Can I jump in there? Sure. Well, I was going to say, I've found that particular question really interesting when I've been invited to speak from the Faculty of Law to Faculty of Religious Studies people and scholars, particularly because of their, and it connects to my answer to the earlier question, their concern about when they read a Supreme Court judgment that the court has now set the definition of religion for everybody in Canada. So when Justice Iacobucci in the Supreme Court of Canada says, in essence, religion is about freely and deeply held personal convictions or beliefs connected to an individual's spiritual faith, integrally linked to one's self-definition and spiritual fulfillment, and then scholars in religious studies say, well, but we don't want to work with that definition. And then my response, and then they're looking at me like blaming me as a freshman on the law. Like, how did you come up with that?
Lawyer.
And then my answer back is, why would you possibly think that how you understand religion is affected at all by what the Supreme Court of Canada asked to do a particular job, right, in terms of answering a claim about the intersection of the Canadian Constitution and the Quebec Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms with private law with respect to this individual will kind of have to say about the court, in a sense, has to give that definition, but it doesn't then erase all the other self-understandings or definitions of religion. Now, I see you kind of saying, well, I mean, the thing is that it's a powerful statement, though, right? And that's true. And the court, in saying it, sets the tone, sets up a way of thinking about religion for the purposes of not only constitutional jurisprudence, but also for everyday conversation. It does have that kind of impact, not that kind of a direct tell everybody what they now have to think about it, but it does have that, and that's something to think about. And then my humorous answer is that there has been actually a serious book written recently on hockey as a religion in Quebec, with all of the features and elements of any religious faith, structures, institutions, notions of membership and belief practices. And so, right, that's interesting to think about.
Can I ask a quick question? Because coming, as I do, more from the world of public policy and politics, and I really appreciated Professor Young's very brilliant explanation of the Hobby Lobby case and RIFRA. And when we think sort of about the mental gymnastics to some degree that courts and judges go through to try to find the balancing act. And then we think, on the other hand, of the broader policy goals that you talked about enunciating in your commission report of basically wanting to create a civic and a civil and a respectful public space where everybody feels they can enter and be part of that public space, whatever their convictions, whether they have convictions or none at all. What do you think, and this is sort of directed at you, Professor Young, are the implications of the cases that are now coming down the road, the florists, the cake bakers, and the wedding photographers, and perhaps wedding singers? As you said, all of those involved to some degree expressive conduct, but I think from the perspective of the religious part of America that those future plaintiffs represent, in addition to seeking to assert specifically their freedom of conscience and belief and their religious claims under the First Amendment, they are also seeking to push back against the broader cultural notion that what you believe, your beliefs, sincere and deeply held about the nature of marriage as a sacred covenant, as a sacred sacrament of your religious beliefs, is no longer a socially acceptable view. And at the end of the day, I think that's where we break down politically in our societies, is when views deeply, deeply held by, certainly in the United States, probably still a significant majority of the people, are beginning to be described as no longer socially acceptable, as being outside the pale of civilized thinking and civilized feeling, and that people who believe a certain way about traditional marriage really are unmasking themselves as unredeemable bigots and hateful people. And that's, I think, where sort of the discussion that we have at one level, which is a very interesting and intellectually challenging and exciting and sophisticated discussion, meets the road of how do you actually create a society where people feel with a degree of reasonableness accepted and accommodated in a shared public space.
That's not a very easy question to answer. I think so. The one small point and one larger one. I think one of the most interesting arguments in these cases is that these are state statutes that forbid discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. And one argument that the photographers and the cake bakers and things have made is we're not discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation. We take pictures, family photos and things for gay people all the time. We bake cakes for gay people all the time. We will certainly serve them. We don't believe that what they have is a marriage as we think about it. And we don't want to endorse that as inconsistent with our religious beliefs. But we're not, they're very eager to say, we're not prejudiced against homosexuals. And I think that reflects both how far we've come in the broader debate about sexual orientation, and an effort to kind of accommodate the religious belief without getting in the way of that cultural change. I do think I have friends who think that discrimination against gay people is just the same as discrimination on the basis of race, and being against same-sex marriage is just the same as being against interracial marriage, and we may very well get there. I do think that there are a lot more people of goodwill who don't believe in same-sex marriage than there are presently people of goodwill who don't believe in interracial marriage. And that may just be the stage of social development that we're at. But in rushing to the next stage, I don't think we should forget that the reason why public opinion and the culture changed so wonderfully on sexual orientation had to do with a period in which it was okay to believe either way. Federalism had a lot to do with this change. We had jurisdictions where people believe, the majority supported same-sex marriage, and other jurisdictions where they didn't, and the nation as a whole didn't take a position on that, which made it possible for certain jurisdictions to experiment, which made it possible to actually have marriages for other people to look at, and I think that changed a ton of people's minds. But I think if we'd insisted that there was a right and a wrong answer to the question of sexual orientation, all through this process, it would have stayed the way it was, which was there is a right answer, and the right answer is that it's evil to be homosexual. So we went through a period where we kind of agreed to disagree, and that's how we got to where we are now. But I'm afraid we're in danger of forgetting how we got